true scary stories from police officers, creepy cases, and unsolved mysteries. The street was unnervingly quiet, lit only by the dim, orange glow of flickering streetlights. Officer James Carter cruised down the lane in his patrol car, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The hum of the engine was the only sound accompanying him, a constant reminder of the stillness around. For a town that was usually bustling, this felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Carter reached for his coffee, more out of habit than need. Just as the cup touched his lips, the radio crackled to life. The static was sharp, piercing through the silence like a blade. Unit 14, possible disturbance reported near Maple Drive. An abandoned property. Check for trespassing or unusual activity. The dispatcher's voice, calm but insistent, filled the car. He sighed, setting the cup down. Maple Drive was notorious, a street with more urban legends than real crimes. Over the years, abandoned properties had given rise to endless stories from teenagers and drifters who claimed to see shadows or hear whispers. But Carter was practical. Ghosts didn't file complaints, and shadows didn't get arrested. He responded into the radio, Unit 14 en route. The streetlights seemed to grow dimmer as he turned onto Maple Drive, the patrol car's headlights slicing through the thick darkness. The house came into view, a hulking silhouette that seemed to loom over the street. Its boarded-up windows and crumbling facade gave the property a menacing demeanor. Carter parked the car, its engine idling softly, and stepped out. The crunch of his boots on gravel echoed louder than it should have. Inside the car, the radio crackled faintly again, though no voice came through. Carter didn't notice. His focus was on the house. He scanned the yard, his flashlight beam cutting across overgrown grass and broken fences. At first glance, it was as lifeless as it had been for years. As he approached the front steps, he paused. The door, which had been nailed shut the last time anyone bothered to check, was ajar. Not wide open, but enough to suggest someone or something had entered. He keyed the radio. Unit 14, I'm at the property. Front door appears compromised. Proceeding to check the interior. His voice was calm, but his grip on the flashlight tightened slightly. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Damp wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. The beam of his flashlight revealed an interior frozen in decay. Dust blanketed every surface, cobwebs draped like curtains, and the silence was oppressive. Carter called out, "Police! If anyone's here, make yourself known." His voice echoed through the empty halls, bouncing back to him. No response. As he moved deeper into the house, something felt off. It wasn't just the silence. It was the weight of the air, heavy and suffocating. His flashlight flickered momentarily, causing shadows to dance on the walls. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible noise. It wasn't a footstep or a voice, but something inhuman. A scraping sound, distant yet deliberate. He froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. He turned the corner into what appeared to be a living room, his flashlight sweeping across the room. It landed on a broken mirror propped against the wall. For a split second, Carter thought he saw movement in the reflection, a figure behind him. Spinning around, he found nothing but empty space. His heartbeat quickened as he whispered to himself, "Stay focused, James. It's just your mind playing tricks." The radio at his hip crackled again, louder this time, but it wasn't the dispatcher. The sound was distorted, almost like a faint voice struggling to come through. His hands reached for the device, but before he could respond, the radio fell silent once more. The room grew colder. Carter's breath became visible in the beam of his flashlight. "This isn't right," he muttered, slowly backing toward the front door. But just as he turned, the door slammed shut with a force that made him jump. He bolted for the handle, yanking it, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the faint scraping sound began again, growing louder. It was coming from upstairs. Carter glanced back, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. He had a choice: investigate or retreat. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but something, duty, curiosity, or perhaps pride, pushed him to stay. Not all crimes leave behind answers, a voice inside him whispered. The radio crackled one final time, faint static punctuated by an unmistakable noise. A voice, faint and broken, whispering his name. This is where it begins, the kind of story that doesn't just make headlines, but lingers in the minds of those who hear it. Mysteries like these aren't just about the crimes themselves, but about the darkness they leave behind. These are 3 stories from the files of law enforcement, where the truth is as chilling as the unknown. What happens when those sworn to protect us become the victims of the unknown? Story 1. The disappearance of Officer Miller. Officer Thomas Miller was the kind of police officer every town wanted. Dedicated, respected, and known for his unwavering sense of duty. For over a decade, he had patrolled the quiet streets of Rivertown, a sleepy little place where crime rarely escalated beyond minor disputes. But small towns often harbor their own mysteries, and on the night of October 12th, those mysteries came calling for Officer Miller. It started with a call to dispatch. A local resident reported hearing strange noises coming from the old Harper house, a long-abandoned property on the edge of town. The Harper house had a reputation, a dark one. Decades ago, it was the site of a family tragedy, and since then, it had fallen into disrepair. Kids dared each other to approach it on Halloween, but no one stayed long. The place gave off an undeniable feeling of unease. When the call came in, Miller was the closest unit. He acknowledged the dispatch without hesitation. Unit 27, en route to the Harper property. ETA 5 minutes, he said, his tone steady. The streets were unusually quiet that night. Miller drove slowly, the familiar landmarks of his patrol blurring in the dim light. As he approached the Harper house, his headlights illuminated the overgrown yard. The house loomed like a shadow, its broken windows and sagging roof giving it the appearance of something alive, watching. He parked his patrol car at the curb, leaving the engine running and his radio crackling faintly in the background. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The air felt heavier here, colder. Miller reached for his flashlight and shone it toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar, its paint peeling and wood splintered. Dispatch, Unit 27. I'm on the scene. Door appears open. I'm proceeding to investigate, he reported. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak as the wind moved through its decaying structure. Miller stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Dust swirled in the air, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. Police department. Anyone here? He called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. No response. The house seemed untouched, as if frozen in time. Furniture sat draped in dusty sheets, and faded wallpaper clung desperately to the walls. Miller moved deeper into the house, his senses heightened. He reached for his radio. Dispatch. Interior appears clear so far. Checking upstairs, he said. As he ascended the creaking staircase, something felt off. The silence was too perfect, almost oppressive. Reaching the second floor, he paused. One of the doors at the end of the hallway was slightly open. The faintest sound, like a whisper, came from within. Hello? Miller called out, moving toward the door. His flashlight flickered briefly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He pushed the door open with his foot, his other hand on his sidearm. Inside was a small bedroom, its only furnishings a bed frame and a broken chair. The window was cracked, letting in a faint breeze. The room was empty. Miller keyed his radio again. Dispatch. I've checked the second floor. No sign of. His words were cut short. A loud thud echoed from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of the front door slamming shut. Miller spun around, his heart pounding. Dispatch. Possible intruder. Stand by, he said, moving quickly toward the stairs. When he reached the ground floor, the front door was wide open. The cool night air rushed in, and the driveway beyond was empty. Miller stepped outside, scanning the yard with his flashlight. Nothing. Dispatch, I got no visual on anyone. Requesting backup to the Harper property, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The reply from dispatch was garbled, almost unrecognizable. Static filled the line, punctuated by faint, unintelligible noises. Miller frowned, adjusting the radio settings. "Dispatch, repeat, I didn't copy that," he said. But there was no response. The driveway was empty except for his patrol car, still idling with its headlights on. Miller approached the vehicle cautiously, his flashlight flicking between the yard and the house. He opened the driver's side door, checked inside. Everything was as he left it. Then, something caught his attention. A faint sound coming from the woods behind the house. It was rhythmic like footsteps, but uneven. Miller moved toward the tree line, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "This is Officer Miller with Rivertown PD. Come out where I can see you," he ordered. The footsteps stopped. The only sound now was the wind rustling through the trees. Miller stepped closer, his pulse quickening. He called out again, but there was no answer. That was the last transmission anyone ever received from Officer Miller. When backup arrived 20 minutes later, they found his patrol car still running, its headlights piercing the dark. His flashlight lay abandoned on the ground near the tree line. The Harper house was searched thoroughly, but there was no sign of him. The woods were combed by search teams for days, but Officer Miller had vanished without a trace. His disappearance became the talk of Rivertown, spawning countless theories but offering no answers. To this day, no one knows what happened to Officer Thomas Miller on the night he vanished. The search for Officer Thomas Miller began within minutes of his last radio transmission. His colleagues arrived at the Harper house to find the scene eerily untouched. The patrol car sat idling in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. His flashlight, scuffed but functional, lay a few feet away near the edge of the woods. Beyond that, there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading into the forest, and no indication of where Miller could have gone. Inside the Harper house, investigators combed every inch of the decaying property. The air was thick with dust, and the creaks of the old wooden floorboards amplified the tense silence. Every room was searched, every corner inspected, but nothing seemed out of place. The house was exactly as Miller had described in his final transmission, abandoned, still, and devoid of life. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the house. Search parties equipped with flashlights and thermal imaging scoured the dense woods behind the property. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights illuminating the treetops. For days, volunteers and law enforcement worked tirelessly, but the forest seemed to swallow their efforts whole. It was as though Miller had vanished into thin air. Then came the first lead, or at least what seemed like one. 2 days after Miller's disappearance, a local resident reported seeing someone who matched his description walking along a rural road several miles from the Harper house. The witness, a truck driver, claimed that the figure seemed disoriented, walking in the middle of the road before vanishing into the tree line as the truck approached. "I swear it was him," the driver insisted during questioning. "He looked lost, like he didn't know where he was." The lead sent search teams into overdrive. The area where the sighting occurred was thoroughly searched, but again, no trace of Miller was found. The witness's account was compelling, but without evidence, it remained just that, an account. Adding to the mystery was a chilling discovery made by the department's technical team. They analyzed Miller's final radio transmission in hopes of finding clues. At first, it seemed like a routine message distorted by static. But when the audio was enhanced, something unusual emerged, a faint, unidentifiable noise beneath Miller's voice. The sound was difficult to describe. Some said it resembled a low hum. Others thought it was closer to whispering. Experts who examined the recording couldn't agree on its origin. It wasn't feedback, interference, or anything they could conclusively identify. Theories began to swirl. Some believed the noise was environmental, perhaps wind or wildlife caught by Miller's microphone. Others speculated it was something else entirely, something unexplainable. Whatever it was, it added another layer of unease to an already baffling case. As days turned into weeks, the investigation stalled. Leads dried up, and the search parties were disbanded. The Harper house, once the center of attention, fell silent again. Officers who had worked the case spoke of an unshakable feeling of unease, as though the house itself were hiding something. Years passed, and Miller's disappearance became one of Rivertown's most enduring mysteries. His name was etched into the collective memory of the community, but answers remained elusive. Theories ranged from the plausible to the outlandish. Some believed he had encountered someone in the Harper house, someone who didn't want to be found. Others speculated that the forest held dangers unknown, that it had claimed him in ways no one could understand. And then there were the whispers, the stories that spread quietly among those who had been closest to the case. They spoke of the noise on the recording, the witnesses who claimed to see Miller long after he should have been gone. They spoke of the Harper house itself, its dark history, and the unsettling feeling it left with everyone who entered. The official case file remained open but dormant, a reminder of an investigation that had run out of leads. Officer Miller's badge and uniform were placed in the town's small police museum, a silent tribute to a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. For the residents of Rivertown, the disappearance of Officer Miller became a story passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about the unknown. The Harper house, now fenced off and officially condemned, stood as a grim monument to that fateful night. No one entered the property anymore, not even on a dare. And as the years went by, the mystery of Officer Miller's disappearance grew only deeper, a reminder that not all questions have answers, and not all stories have endings. Story 2. The gas station murder. It was a chilly autumn night when 24-year-old Emily Carter pulled her car into the gravel lot of an old, rural gas station on Route 56. She had been driving back to her college town after visiting her family for the weekend. The gas station, dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent light, stood as a lonely beacon in the vast stretch of countryside. Security footage later revealed her last moments inside the store. Emily, dressed in a light jacket and jeans, walked in with a soft smile. She exchanged a brief word with the cashier, an older man who seemed preoccupied with the radio behind the counter. She paid for a bottle of water and a pack of gum, then exited the store at precisely 11:23 p.m. What happened after that would haunt investigators for years. At 11:45 p.m., a passing truck driver noticed Emily's car still parked at the gas station, its headlights off and the engine cold. Concerned, he pulled over and honked his horn, but no one came out. Walking toward the back of the building, he stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Emily's lifeless body sprawled on the ground beneath the shadow of a weathered dumpster. The crime scene was perplexing. There were no immediate signs of a struggle inside the gas station. The shelves were undisturbed, and the floor was clean except for the faint footprints left by the truck driver. Even outside, where Emily was found, the scene was oddly tidy. Her belongings, purse, phone, and keys, remained untouched inside her locked car. The condition of her body, however, told a chilling story. The attack had been swift and violent, leaving no chance for her to call for help. Despite the brutality, there were no witnesses, no obvious weapons left behind, and no discernible motive. Robbery was quickly ruled out, as her wallet was still full, and the expensive watch on her wrist remained intact. Detectives combed through the surveillance footage, but it yielded more questions than answers. Emily had left the store and walked back to her car, as expected. But moments later, she veered sharply toward the rear of the gas station, stepping out of the camera's view. No one else was seen on the tape during that time. It was as if she had been lured, or perhaps forced, into the darkness. The cashier, the only other person present at the time, was immediately questioned. He claimed he hadn't seen anything unusual. She seemed like a nice girl, he told investigators. Bought her stuff and left. Didn't seem nervous or anything. When asked why he hadn't noticed the truck driver honking or found Emily's body, he admitted that he had been distracted by a baseball game playing on the radio. His alibi checked out, but something about his demeanor left detectives uneasy. The autopsy revealed no traces of substances in Emily's system, ruling out theories that she had been incapacitated before the attack. Forensic evidence was scarce. No fingerprints, no foreign DNA, no footprints other than the truck driver's. It was as if her attacker had vanished into the night, leaving no trace of their presence. As investigators delved deeper, they uncovered a chilling detail that deepened the mystery. 3 years earlier, another young woman had been found dead under eerily similar circumstances just 30 miles away, at another rural gas station along Route 56. That case, too, remained unsolved. The parallels between the two incidents sent a shiver through the community. Both women had been traveling alone at night. Both had stopped at isolated gas stations. Both had been killed in a manner that left behind no leads, no suspects, and no answers. The gas station where Emily was found became a grim landmark, avoided by locals and travelers alike. Flowers and candles were left by strangers who mourned her loss, their gestures of sympathy mingling with a growing sense of fear. As for Emily's case, it became a puzzle that law enforcement couldn't piece together. Detectives pursued every possible lead, from interviewing nearby residents to examining the cashier's background. They even enlisted the help of behavioral analysts, who theorized that the perpetrator might be someone with a deep understanding of forensics, someone who knew how to kill without leaving a trace. Yet, despite their efforts, the case grew colder with each passing day. The story of Emily Carter's tragic death joined the ranks of unsolved crimes that haunt the collective memory, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers that lurk in the shadows of the familiar. And as the years went by, one question lingered. Who or what had drawn Emily behind that gas station on that fateful night? Months passed, and while Emily Carter's murder weighed heavily on the town, the lack of answers began to shift the tragedy into the background of daily life. But just as the shock started to dull, another crime shattered the fragile peace. It was late spring when a call came in to the local sheriff's department. A motorist had discovered a body behind a remote gas station, eerily similar to the scene of Emily's death. The victim, 29-year-old Lauren Matthews, had stopped for fuel while traveling alone. Like Emily, she had entered the store, purchased a drink, and exited into the night, only to never make it back to her car. Detectives arrived to find a chillingly familiar scene. Lauren's body lay just out of view of the station's cameras, her car parked neatly by the pumps. Her belongings, like Emily's, were untouched. And just like before, no weapon, no footprints, and no trace of the attacker were found. The similarities between the two cases were undeniable. Both victims were women traveling alone at night. Both were last seen on security footage entering and leaving rural gas stations, and both were attacked outside camera view. This time, however, the surveillance footage offered a small but significant clue: a shadowy figure loitering near the edge of the frame shortly before Lauren walked out. The figure appeared to be male, tall and thin, wearing a hooded jacket that obscured his face. He stood just beyond the station's light, pacing and occasionally glancing toward the building. Though the image was too grainy for identification, it was enough to convince investigators that these crimes were the work of the same person. The media quickly picked up the story, dubbing the perpetrator the Highway Phantom. News outlets painted a grim picture of a calculated individual preying on lone travelers, someone who knew how to evade detection and leave no evidence behind. Theories ranged from a truck driver with an intimate knowledge of back roads to a transient who drifted from town to town, blending into the shadows. A breakthrough seemed imminent when a witness came forward. A local farmer driving home late that night recalled seeing a man walking along the highway near the second gas station. He described the figure as wearing dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag. The man hadn't flagged him down or acted suspiciously, but the timing and location matched the crime. Unfortunately, the description was too vague to produce any solid leads. Authorities distributed composite sketches based on the witness's account, but the Highway Phantom remained elusive. Increased patrols and heightened security measures were implemented along Route 56. Gas stations installed additional cameras, and employees were instructed to report any unusual activity. Travelers were warned to avoid stopping at night, and those who had to were advised to remain vigilant. Despite these precautions, fear gripped the community. Rumors swirled about more victims, though none were confirmed. Every shadowed figure seen lingering at a gas station, every unclaimed vehicle by the roadside, became a potential threat in the minds of residents. Behavioral profilers brought in by law enforcement theorized that the Phantom was not impulsive but methodical, choosing his victims carefully. His preference for remote locations suggested someone familiar with the area, perhaps even someone who had grown up there. Yet, despite the psychological profiles and mounting public pressure, the investigation hit a dead end. The case became a symbol of unanswered questions and unresolved fears, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in the most unsuspecting places. Families of the victims mourned not just their losses, but the lack of closure. Who was the man in the hooded jacket? What drove him to commit such acts? And why did he choose those gas stations, those women, those nights? Years later, the murders of Emily Carter and Lauren Matthews remained unsolved. The highway phantom became a legend whispered among locals, a chilling cautionary tale for anyone who dared to travel alone after dark. For the families and friends of the victims, however, the story was far from over. It was a wound that refused to heal, a mystery that demanded answers, even as time continued to pass without them. And somewhere, perhaps in the shadow of another lonely highway, the phantom lingered, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. Story 3. The Locked Motel Room. It was the middle of summer when Sarah and James Matthews, a young couple on a cross-country road trip, decided to take a break from the long highway drive. They pulled into a small, quiet town and checked into the one motel that looked to offer a peaceful rest. The worn sign outside read Sunset Motel, a place far removed from the fast-paced world they had left behind. The couple, exhausted from days of driving, barely noticed the peeling paint or the dimly lit parking lot as they made their way to room number 14. Their evening was simple: a quick dinner at a diner down the street, a bottle of wine shared between them, and a long conversation about their future. The warm night air carried the hum of crickets, and the faint glow of the motel's neon lights flickered in the distance. They retired to their room, locking the door behind them, ready to sleep and continue their journey the next morning. But the morning light brought with it something no one could have predicted. At dawn, the motel manager, Linda, went to check on the couple after they failed to check out. When she reached their door, she knocked several times, but received no response. Worried, she called the local sheriff's department to request a welfare check. The officers who arrived were met with an unsettling scene. The door to room 14 was locked from the inside, and the window was undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no marks on the doorframe. Yet, when the door was unlocked and opened, the sight inside was nothing short of horrifying. Sarah and James were found on the floor, their bodies sprawled in a gruesome display of violence. Both had been stabbed multiple times, their lives tragically cut short. The room itself, though small, seemed oddly undisturbed. The bed was neatly made, personal items remained on the small dresser, and the bathroom door was closed. But it was the locked door that struck the investigators as the most perplexing detail of all. There were no signs of struggle in the room, no broken furniture, and, most strangely, no indication of how the killer had gained access. The only clue that remained was a single, bloody knife lying on the floor near the couple's bodies. But there were no fingerprints, no hairs, no DNA. Nothing that could help the authorities trace the weapon back to a suspect. Detective Sarah Green, an experienced investigator with a calm demeanor, took charge of the case. She immediately noted the strange circumstances surrounding the deaths. The room had been locked from the inside. If there had been an intruder, they would have had to leave through the same door that was locked, and there was no evidence of this. What's more, the knife was peculiar in its own right. It wasn't the motel's own kitchen knife, nor was it anything special. It appeared to be an old, nondescript blade, one that didn't stand out in any way. Green worked tirelessly to understand how a killer could have committed such a brutal act in a locked room. Was it a crime of passion? Or was it a cold and calculated act, designed to leave no trace? All the usual suspects, an ex-lover, a random criminal, were quickly ruled out as the couple had no known enemies, no debts, and no reason to be targeted. A surveillance camera outside the motel captured no one entering or leaving the room. A check of the motel's guest list showed that no one had entered the room during the night, other than the couple. The other guests reported nothing unusual. No one had heard anything, no screams or sounds of distress. With no clear evidence pointing to a suspect, Detective Green examined every detail of the couple's stay. She spoke to the motel manager, Linda, who revealed something odd. The couple had arrived late, just before the office closed. When they checked in, Linda noticed that Sarah seemed slightly anxious, almost nervous, but she didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a brief interaction, and the couple paid in cash, leaving no traceable credit card information. The investigation quickly grew more complex as Green's team interviewed other guests. One elderly woman recalled hearing a car pull up to the motel at 2 a.m., but she hadn't seen anyone get out. A truck driver who had parked his rig next to the motel for the night reported hearing nothing unusual either. Everything about the situation seemed to be a perfect crime, with no clear answers, no witnesses, and no physical evidence linking anyone to the deaths. As the days passed, more questions arose. Could it have been an inside job? Had someone within the motel staff been involved? But again, there was no indication that anyone at the motel was involved, and all employees had alibis. The case continued to baffle investigators. Was it a crime of opportunity? Was there a dark secret hiding in the couple's past that led to their brutal end? And most importantly, who had committed this seemingly perfect crime and why? No one could provide the answers, and the case slowly drifted into the realm of cold cases. The locked room remained a haunting reminder of the crime that no one could explain. Despite the passage of time, Detective Green never gave up on finding the truth, though the silence surrounding Sarah and James's deaths lingered unanswered. For the town, the question was no longer about what happened, but whether the killer would ever be found. And for those still traveling across the country, the Sunset Motel, once a quiet pit stop, became a chilling symbol of the perfect crime, a place where mysteries never found resolution. As the days turned into weeks, Detective Sarah Green found herself growing more frustrated with the lack of tangible evidence in the case of Sarah and James Matthews' deaths. Every lead seemed to fizzle out into nothing, leaving only more questions and fewer answers. With no apparent motive, no suspects, and no eyewitnesses, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. Yet, despite the dead end, Green couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something about the case was deeply connected to something much older, something that had occurred in the same place years before. The initial theories were predictable. Green's team had quickly ruled out random acts of violence, given the locked door and the fact that the couple had no known enemies. The most logical theory that emerged early on was that the couple had been victims of a disgruntled former employee of the Sunset Motel. There had been rumors among the locals of a man named Dean Whitley, a former night clerk who had been fired a few years prior for theft. Whitley had been known to have a violent temper, and his past was filled with stories of threats and altercations. Some speculated that he could have returned to the motel in the dead of night, killed the couple, and then somehow disappeared without a trace. However, after a thorough investigation into Whitley's background, the police discovered nothing linking him to the crime. His whereabouts on the night of the murder were accounted for, and there was no physical evidence, no motive, and no witnesses who could place him at the motel. Whitley's alibi was solid, and with no way to tie him to the murders, he quickly fell off the list of suspects. Green wasn't ready to let go of the idea that someone familiar with the motel had to be involved. She began to think that perhaps it wasn't a single person, but rather a group or a series of people with knowledge of the motel's layout and routines. Another theory floated among the local community was the possibility of a copycat killer, a person who had been inspired by the unsolved murders in the area. This theory was fueled by the strange similarities between the case of Sarah and James and a string of unsolved crimes that had plagued the small town over the years. A particularly chilling detail came to light when one of the officers uncovered a connection to a death that had occurred in the same room years earlier. In 1983, a young couple, Emily and Mark, had also checked into room 14 for a night of rest during a road trip. Similar to the Matthews case, the couple was found dead the next morning. Room 14 was locked from the inside, and once again, there was no sign of forced entry. The couple had been brutally murdered, with no suspects, no clues, and no witnesses. The only thing that connected the two cases was the eerie similarity in the way the victims were killed and the locked room mystery that surrounded the deaths. The police had initially chalked up Emily and Mark's deaths as a random act of violence, and it had faded into the background of other unsolved cases. But now, with the Matthews case fresh in the minds of the investigators, the similarities between the two crimes seemed undeniable. Could it have been the same killer, returning after all these years? Or was it a new killer, somehow drawn to the motel and compelled to recreate the brutal crime? The townspeople began to whisper about the strange coincidences, with some believing that room 14 was cursed, haunted by a dark force that compelled people to die within its walls. Others theorized that someone had been silently watching the room over the years, waiting for the right moment to strike. There was a growing sense of unease among the locals, who started to avoid the Sunset Motel altogether. Even tourists passing through the area seemed to sense that something was amiss. The once popular stop for weary travelers now stood empty for days at a time, as word spread of the unsettling deaths. Detective Green was not one to entertain superstitions, but the connection between the two deaths remained haunting. Could these murders truly be the work of one person, who had somehow managed to slip through the cracks of the investigation years ago? Or was it possible that the motel had become a symbol of death, drawing people into its dark orbit? The case continued to haunt Green as the months passed, and while she was determined to solve the mystery, the lack of evidence made it feel as though she was chasing shadows. Theories continued to abound, but none of them were enough to bring closure to the victims or the community. The town became divided. Some believed that the killings were simply the work of a dangerous criminal who had been operating under the radar for years, while others couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. With no new leads and the case growing colder by the day, Detective Green was forced to make the difficult decision to scale back the investigation. Though she was no closer to the truth, the haunting details of the case stayed with her. As the motel became less of a destination and more of a dark legend, its reputation grew. No one wanted to stop there anymore. Travelers passing through town would glance at the Sunset Motel, its neon sign now flickering in the distance, but few would dare to set foot inside. Locals avoided the place, and tourists steered clear of its dark history. The motel had gained a reputation, and the connection between the two unsolved murders remained a chilling reminder of the past. It stood as a monument to mystery, a place that was no longer just a stopover, but a symbol of all the unanswered questions that had piled up over the years. In the years that followed, room 14 remained vacant, its door always locked, the window always shut. It became an eerie relic of the town's darkest secrets, and even the bravest of travelers could not shake the sense that something terrible had once occurred within those walls. The case was never solved, and the Sunset Motel became a ghost of its former self, abandoned, ignored, and left to quietly decay, a place where the truth would never be uncovered. And so, the town continued on, its residents haunted by the knowledge that some mysteries, no matter how hard we try, may never be solved. The chilling connection between the two murders remained a mystery, one that would linger in the minds of those who had lived through it, a reminder of the darkness that sometimes hides in plain sight. As we close the chapter on these chilling cases, it's impossible to ignore the common thread that ties them together. Each story, whether it's the disappearance of Officer Miller, the unsolved murders at the gas stations, or the locked motel room deaths, reminds us of the limitations of our understanding. No matter how much we investigate, no matter how many hours we pour into uncovering the truth, some mysteries remain unsolved, hidden in the shadows and out of reach. What makes these stories so unsettling is not just the bizarre circumstances surrounding each crime, but the chilling reality that sometimes even the most diligent efforts fail to bring us closer to the answers we seek. These cases also serve as stark reminders of the emotional toll that such events have on those involved. The families of the victims, left with nothing but unanswered questions and an unbearable sense of loss, live with the knowledge that their loved ones' fates are shrouded in darkness. For the investigators, the strain of chasing down leads that never seem to lead anywhere, the haunting feeling that they may never find justice, weighs heavily. The human cost of these mysteries is real. Each case is not just a puzzle, but a story of lives lost and lives changed forever. And then there's the chilling realization that sometimes the truth is even more terrifying than fiction. We like to think we can explain everything, that every crime has a clear reason behind it, but sometimes the truth is far stranger and more unsettling than we can imagine. In these cases, the absence of answers creates a kind of terror that lingers in the air, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable fact that some stories may never reach their conclusion. These unresolved mysteries also serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of our safety. We live in a world where, despite our best efforts, things can go horribly wrong in an instant. What might seem like a normal night at a gas station or a routine check of an abandoned house can quickly turn into something far darker, something that no one is prepared for. We trust in the systems we've put in place, in law enforcement, in the safety of our neighborhoods, but we are reminded here that nothing is ever truly guaranteed. In the end, these stories are not just about unsolved crimes. They are about the unpredictable world we live in. They are about how fleeting our sense of security can be, and how in the blink of an eye, everything can change. But perhaps the most important takeaway is this: vigilance is essential. We cannot afford to grow complacent. We must remain aware, question everything, and never assume that we are safe from the unknown. Because the truth is, we never really know what might be lurking just out of sight. As we close this chapter, we leave you with a question to ponder. How many more untold stories are out there, waiting for answers that may never come? How many mysteries still hide in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to look for them? The truth, in its darkest form, may never be fully revealed, but it's the quest for it that continues to drive us all.